Today here I'm with Niklas from Fraunhofer, Niklas Reinhardt, and Anushe from IEECP as well. And today, let's say we are facilitating this session for you. My name is Konstantina Karalaiou from IEECP as well. And yes, that's all. With no further delay, I think I can give the floor to Niklas and we can begin. And thank you once more, of course, for being here today.
All right, now you should be able to see the screen. Yes, perfect. So what is the agenda now for this presentation? First, I will give you a little bit background for the project itself and why this work is important or what it is important for. Then we will discuss quickly the methodological framework. I can also give you here some further material at hand where you can really have a deep dive then for the methodological framework. However, I will show you the general framework and how we approach this issue in the tool. Then I will present you some, on a general level, just some potential use cases. So what is this tool intended for to use? What are the cases you can analyze with this tool? And then we will have a little look at what kind of input data is required from your end, so as a tool user, but also what type of guidance material, of user guidance and of user support is available in the tool and surrounding the tool. And then, as Konstantina already mentioned, we will go over to a hands-on tool presentation. We have here several potential use cases, and we can also select one which you are most interested in as just as an example to go through in the tool. And then we will end with a Q&A. But as I said, as we are a small round, feel free to jump in between for questions, clarification needs, and so on. So starting with the introduction, I guess you all know what these multiple impacts are. They are also referred to as multiple benefits, for example. And they were first systematically put together by the IEA more than 10 years ago, and they can be categorized into different categories. So environmental impacts, for example, such as, of course, GHG emissions, but also air pollutants. And then economic impacts, for example, the impact on employment or macroeconomic impacts in general, such as on GDP. And social impacts, for example, regarding energy poverty, but also health impacts, for example, due to air pollution or due to an improved living conditions in the residential sector. In general, these multiple impacts can provide really valuable arguments to implement energy efficiency measures, but they are still rarely reported. And that's a little bit a problem, because if we ignore these multiple benefits or multiple impacts, this undermines the cost effectiveness of energy efficiency solutions. And so in the European context, we have now the so-called energy efficiency first principle put in place in the EED recast from now more or less 3 years ago, which calls for a fair comparison of energy supply and energy efficiency and energy-related decisions. So basically, to always account for these multiple impacts, to have an equal comparison then when you assess different options to go forward, for example, in policymaking, but also when you decide on, for example, which projects are most beneficial for the whole society overall. So what is this energy efficiency first principle? As I already said, it's enshrined in Article 3 of the Energy Efficiency Directive. And here it basically requires member states to ensure that energy efficiency solutions are assessed in planning policy and major investment decisions. So then there are some caveats, what are major investment decisions, but basically the overall picture is that energy efficiency solutions shall be assessed if you have or if you go for major energy solutions. And then to specify this, in applying these principle, member states shall then use cost-benefit methodologies that allow a proper assessment of the wider benefits of energy efficiency solutions. So that's exactly what I showed before on the slides, to really take into account all these broader benefits of energy efficiency, such as health, such as impacts on the economy, to really get the full picture and to make a best informed decision when, for example, deciding whether you go for some additional renewable capacities you install, or you go for some residential improvement actions, so building renovations, for example, to have then really the outcome which is most beneficial for the whole society. In addition, there are also some further more specific links, for example, to address the impact on energy poverty, which can be one of the major multiple impacts or multiple benefits of energy efficiency. Then this principle should also be integrated or should also be reported on into the NECP progress reports. So the next one is due next year, and this one would also the first one where this is due. So coming March, all member states need to report on how they put this principle into practice and how they took into account these broader multiple benefits of energy efficiency. So that's how it's like stated in the law and the legislation. So now you may wonder, okay, how to put all these, I mean, it's still a lot of vague requirements, right? So how to put all these aspects into practice. And therefore the EU published a guidance note or recommendation. And here basically they set out a proper approach how to assess these multiple impacts. And here first step would be to identify relevant multiple impacts, then to quantify them in physical units, and then as a last step to monetize them. And while monetizing and quantifying them, it's really important to avoid double counting. So to have no overlaps if you aggregate all these multiple impacts, as some of them may be prone to such double counting issues. Then again is just a little bit more elaboration on these methodology for the CBA, for the cost-benefit analysis. And here again, it states that the authorities who have to implement the energy efficiency first principle have to do this implementation based on a societal CBA. So that means basically that you take into account all these wider aspects and not optimize, for example, only on a purely company level outcome your decision. So based on this basically is what I just said. You have, if you do CBAs, you have different possibilities to do so. Normally, if you're a private entity, you would do for a technical analysis or for a financial analysis, so really the perspective of the investor. So when do you get your money back, basically would be the key question. However, for the regulated entities and for public entities who now needs to implement the energy efficiency first principle, they need to put or use as a basis the societal CBA. So have an economic analysis and taking the perspective of society as a whole. Therefore, as I said, it's not the main question, okay, when do the investments pay back? But the question is, which solutions do we have the most benefits in the outcome or in the pathway forward? All right, with all these background information in mind, we have in the MICAT project the main objective to support the European Union, but also all its member states at all governance levels in including these multiple impacts and multiple benefits in the operationalization and implementation of this principle. And we do this by using a strong and reliable analytical tool, the so-called MICATool, so multiple impact calculation tool, which is an open source online tool. So you can also download the whole source code. You can download like 90% of the background data we are using, and you can adapt it to your needs, and you can use it for free without any registration or costs involved. And in this session now, I want to really give you a good overview of if you want to use the tool, where to start, where to find information, what you need to put in there, what to keep in mind if you have a look at the results and so on. All right, so next step would be the methodological framework of the tool. And here you see the methodological framework for the energy efficiency part of the tool. However, we extended this framework, but this will be shown on the next slides. But basically, the whole idea is to have exactly these steps as laid out in the guidance note. So we have, of course, input data, which can be provided by country, by energy carrier, and by sector and or measure. And of course, on the different governance levels, so EU level, national or local. And here, what is needed, I will show you later on, and for what data types we have back backend default data. Then as a first step, using this input data and all the default data in the tool, we calculate the quantified impacts in physical units with so-called impact factors or functions. Then these results are directly used for the monetization via monetization factors. And then as a last step, we have some aggregation rules to aggregate all these monetized impacts while avoiding these double counting issues. So why do I put so much emphasis on these impact factors? The reason behind this is that basically the whole tool is still indicator-based. So we have still an indicator-based approach. Of course, we have a lot of modeling results, of modeling parameters, which were fed into the tool and used in the parameterization and in the development of the indicators as default data, for example. But still, the calculation itself often boils down in a simplified description now to X, Y, Z, right? And then you end up with a result. And but a whole lot of information is in this backend default parameters and which data is used and so on. So basically, you have in the tool directly fulfilled all the steps which are like demanded also in the guidance note of the European Commission. So this is a framework for the energy efficiency part of the module. So if you want to analyze energy efficiency measures or improvement actions. However, we extended this framework now to be able to also analyze renewable energy installed capacities, basically. The reasoning behind this was that if we now go or look into the future, we will have an increasingly stronger competition, not between like maybe energy efficiency and fossil fuels, right, or between renewables and fossil fuels, but as we like push out slowly the fossil fuels out of the system, there will also be a competition on the question which share of energy efficiency, so energy saving towards renewables is the best for the whole society, is maybe the best, the most cost effective, so brings the best benefits, or the most important ones. And with this in mind, we try to now extend this tool to be able also to analyze such questions. Here, the structure is exactly the same. So we try to have really one tool, and the users don't have to learn like a second tool, right? It's still exactly the same approach we are using. However, now we have slightly different input data, of course, so not energy savings, but we have now the installed capacities per renewable energy technology. And then, of course, the default data and the calculation approach for some of the indicators is changed or is changing depending on what you are choosing. But basically, the whole working flow and the presentation of the results is exactly the same. So you just only need to learn the tool once, and then you are set to go with both modules, let's say. All right, a little bit more detailed look into the different steps. So the first step is this impact quantification. And as I said, as we really aim to support all governance levels, and we try to cover the whole EU, so all member states, the aim was really also to keep it applicable for a broad target group and cover a wide range of use cases. So what does that mean? That means basically you want to have as less data input requirements as possible. So you should be able to use the tool with only really a little bit of data needs. But then we want to be flexible. So you can adapt a lot of the data used in the tool if you have more data, if you have better data, if you're interested in specific questions or in a specific analysis or specific use case. However, the idea was really to keep it really simple so that a lot of people can use it, and that the tool itself, that's also the reason that it's indicator based, is really fast and responsive. So it's really meant as a day-to-day supporting tool in your work as a first step in assessing these questions, but it's not meant to replace a full-fledged modeling of multiple impacts or a full-fledged modeling approach for an impact assessment of policy measures. I guess that's also already clear by the setup, but as like an advantage then we gain out of this is really that we really cover like all of the EU, all of the member states, and we have a like comparable methodology, comparable data sources, of course, for all member states. So we can really have different analysis really quickly on different member states, on different use cases, and on different governance levels. And it will only, if you once have learned the tool, it will only take you like basically a few seconds to enter the data. So the most work will be, of course, to set up your use case, but I guess that's normal. So as I said, the only mandatory input is energy savings or installed capacity. All the other ones are not mandatory, but I will provide you more details on this later on. Then the next step is the impact monetization. And here we try to convert as many of these multiple benefits as possible to monetary values. It's not possible for all of these indicators because some, of course, there's not a direct link between the physical unit quantification and a monetized value. For other ones, there is just no reliable monetization factor available, or not at least available across all member states. And that's, again, then one of the advantages we don't want to give up. So we really try to keep the level of detail in the tool exactly the same for all member states, and don't want to start to have more indicators for some member states and less for the others. So if we don't have the data for all of them, we mostly skipped the introduction into the tool. Again, why it is important? It's simply important because these monetized values can then have a significant impact on the results of a CBA and can really alter the final outcome of a CBA if you add these to your analysis. All right. As for all the other data in the tool, also these monetization factors, for example, such as the cost of carbon or value of a statistical life or value of a workday, are all already provided as default data in the tool, but they can all be altered by you if you have different values you want to investigate, if you want to play around with it. So it's all up to you to fine tune the tool to your needs. And then after the step of the monetization, we have finally the impact aggregation. And here again, we directly push out some indicators, but not so many due to double counting. And for some, we really clearly indicate where double counting would occur. One example would be, for example, the impact on the value of houses, so of improved buildings. And here, this would have a large double counting with energy cost savings because the energy cost savings are directly feeding into the increased value of a building in the methodology. Therefore, we have a strong indication that, okay, please don't include both of these indicators in your CBA analysis, for example. Then, if you have decided which indicators you want to include in the CBA, you have the possibility to play around with different parameters of the CBA, such as the discount rate, the energy prices as a sensitivity, the investments as the sensitivities, and of course, not directly in the CBA part, but in all the input parts, you can alter the monetization factors or, for example, lifetimes of your measures, and then have a look how these changes the outcome of your analysis. And what are the outcomes of this analysis in the end? So we have all the standard CBA indicators in the tool, for example, the net present value, the benefit cost or cost benefit ratio, the annuity, and of course the levelized cost of saved energy or saved GHG emissions. And then you can basically analyze, okay, by taking which indicators into account, how will these parameters change? All right. Any questions so far before I jump on to the use cases? Don't see any. Then, as I said, feel free to jump in also in between. So what are potential use cases for the tool or for the use of the tool? As I said, we want to cover all governance levels, so EU, national, and local. Although this works for the EU level and for national level, we have also the dedicated data. However, for the local level, we use the national data and scale it most of the times. I can show you one practical example later on in the tool, but basically what that means, if you, for example, have a region which differs like substantially from the national average, for example, in the energy mix, then you just need to adapt that manually in the tool because that's a type of data we don't have, of course, for all regions and so on, for all use cases in the tool as default available, but it's possible to adapt the tool that it works and you have also accurate results for this case. Then we have integrated both perspectives in the tool, so you can have an ex-ante evaluation and analysis of measures and policy instruments, or you can have an ex-post view, so having a look at already completed measures and policies. And as I said, the different evaluation subjects. So we have basically, of course, you can analyze how policies or programs. You can also have a look only at dedicated improvement actions. So basically, one policy or one program would, of course, be made up from several improvement actions. So one example would be, for example, you have a funding program in the building sector, and here you fund fuel switch, so heating fuel switch towards heat pump, for example, and building renovations. Then you would have these two improvement actions, of course, to be analyzed in the tool, but you can also have only a look at dedicated single improvement actions, and you can have a look at scenarios, so energy efficiency scenarios. However, this is to be treated a little bit with cautious, because as I said, the tool is indicator based, and we don't have any feedback loops. So if you have now scenarios or you analyze impacts which are really big compared to the overall system you address or you analyze, then we don't have these feedback loops, which would, for example, then recalculate, okay, how would the energy mix change? How would the energy prices change? How would maybe also the cost of certain stuff change? So that's not possible in this indicator-based approach. You can address it a little bit by tweaking the default data, of course. However, it's not, as I said, to replace a full-fledged modeling with several feedback loops and so on. Nevertheless, as a first look and to get an idea of what is the magnitude of all these multiple impacts, it totally works as good as for the policies and improvement actions. So I guess some of these examples I already mentioned, but one example now for the ex-ante evaluation could be the lower one, for example, that would be quite the upper one, that would be one typical one. For example, we have also or we try to address in the project. So if you have, for example, the policy challenge to design a renovation funding program, for example, now on the local level, then you could have the information need of which set of action provides, for example, the highest outcome with regard to social benefits, or for example, what is the subsidy rate you want to have to ensure net benefits overall for you on the local level. Or maybe you could also just wonder which measures have the best impact on energy poverty, right? So which will remove or lift out the most people out of energy poverty. And then you can just play around with your policy funding program setup in the tool with the different parameters, and then compare the different results and see like, okay, which setting is maybe the most promising for your use case. For example, what is the share of building renovation and fuel switch you want to have in your funding program? As an additional example, you could also have a look at different energy efficiency scenarios and then see, okay, which one is maybe from the whole societal perspective the most valuable one. You could also have, of course, in a quite similar way as I just explained for this ex-ante perspective, you could also have a look at ex-post already finalized projects or programs. So taking, for example, the existing evaluation of a funding program and then use the information from this evaluation to add it in the tool or to provide it to the tool, and then to really extend the scope of the evaluation to all these other multiple impacts. And that's also what we did now in a lot of the national showcases, as this is one really straightforward way to have good data, to use good and reliable data in the tool, and then to really have a good picture of the wider impacts of these policies. And then the last one, and maybe that's the most important one for the why you should use the tool in general, also is to support member states, as I said, on all these governance levels, but especially on the national level to fulfill the NECP reporting needs under EU regulation. So basically on implementing implementing the energy efficiency first principle. And for this use case, let's say the tool is also directly referenced in the guidance note, which I mentioned earlier. All right, so now we know what is the methodological framework. We know a little bit, okay, what are the use cases we can go for. We know a little bit what is the reasoning behind the whole setup of the tool. So now we can go a little bit more into the details of if you want to use the tool, what data is required and what user guidance is available. So first, starting off with the most important one, the data. So what are the mandatory input data time series? And here, as I said, we have, depending on whether you use the energy efficiency part of the tool or the renewable part of the tool, we have for each one only one mandatory input data category. And this is basically either the total annual energy savings per sector and improvement action. For example, what amount of energy was saved due to your heating fuel switch and what amount of energy was saved due to your building renovation in the residential sector. Or if you go for the renewable part of the tool, then the total installed capacity of a specific renewable technology would be the only mandatory input data you need. So only with this type of data, you could go directly to the tool, press and analyze, and would get results for all the indicators, so the full set of results and the CBA and so on. However, if you now want to improve your results, there are a lot of different parameters in the tool or different data series you can adjust. And the most important ones, especially if you want to increase accuracy of the results and if you want to use the CBA, then the two in blue are the most important ones you should address as the next step. Number one are the investment costs. These can be adjusted per improvement action in the tool. I can show you later. And this is, of course, as it directly fits into the CBA and it fits directly into the calculation of some of the impacts, especially the economic impacts. This one is a really valuable data point to adjust, especially as we all know that default investment costs, we have some default investment costs per improvement action, per energy saved, but this is often not really reliable because this can differ quite heavily dependent on how did you set up your policy measure, what is your specific targeting in this improvement action, and so on and so forth, in which national context are you. So this is something which is really worth adapting. And then the next one, which is really worth adapting, are the affected fuels. So as you only need to set the whole or provide the whole amount of energy saved, but not divided by energy carriers, you can then also really fine-tune the results or tailor the analysis towards your use case by providing the affected fuels, so the fuel splits saved, basically. We have also some default parameters here and default data. And this is also, I would say, quite more reliable than the investment costs, as we base it on the actual sectoral energy mix for your country, for example, and then dependent on the improvement action, we will adapt this a little bit and then derive these affected fuels as a default parameter. However, if we have some data here, it's really easy to address and to improve the results of your analysis. And then we have a lot of different other parameters you can change depending on what you're interested in, depending on what is available. So on the global parameters, we have the sectoral energy mixes, we have energy prices, we have the electricity and heat generation, and we have all the monetization factors, which can be all. And for the advanced parameters, so the parameters you can adjust per improvement action. You can, for example, then change the lifetime of this action, of the improvement. You can alter the subsidy rate. You can, if you have a look at fuel switch, adjust all the fuel switch parameters, so efficiencies and installed technologies. And especially if you're interested, for example, in social aspects in the residential sector, so energy poverty, for example, then there are a lot of specific residential parameters you can adjust, for example, the number of affected dwellings or the energy poverty target. All right, then in the tool itself, we also try to provide a lot of context-dependent guidance, let's say. So we have these context-dependent which come up as you can see on the bottom example, these yellow boxes, just to remind you of a certain what you need to take into account while altering these parameters, for example. And we have a lot of information buttons which provide you more information on what data is needed here, or what is the context of this field and this input parameter, what default data is used, for example, and so on and so forth. And in a lot of these information boxes, we have an additional link towards the tool documentation, where you get an even more detailed and even more specific explanation of certain aspects of the tool. So one central example would be for the energy savings input. You can then see, okay, as we have seen, what is required are the total annual savings per improvement action. And then if you are unsure of what this metric of total annual savings means, then you can go even further into the documentation, and then we explain to you, okay, what are new annual savings, total annual savings, and cumulative savings, and which is the one you need in the tool. So then you are set up to prepare your data accordingly and to have all the information directly in the tool without the need to go to some other sources and so on. As already mentioned, we have an extensive documentation of the tool, which is a little bit more technical. So you find all the IDs and how we implemented all the calculations actually in the back end. We have also an API, so a programming interface where you can access a tool and directly get some results towards your own model, your own tool, or you can send also input data, for example, to the tool. And that's a more technical explanation of the tool, which is also directly linked in the tool. And in addition, we have also a lot of external further resources. So we have detailed fact sheets per indicator. So that's a little bit more the more detailed background information heavy source of how was this indicator implemented, what was the reasoning to select it or maybe not to select it, what data was used, what is the approach used, what are maybe some caveats and simplifications which had to be made, and so on. Then we have also a comprehensive working paper on the whole methodological framework. So if you want to have a more detailed look into those aspects, you can have a look at this document. And we have extensive training material for the use of the tool. So basically a step-by-step guidance, similar to what I will provide to you like in a minute. All right, then let's go to the hands-on presentation, and feel free to jump in every time with additional questions and so on. So basically we have prepared 3 different use cases. So we have a residential use case. So basically all 3 are from the German showcase in the project. So the residential one would be a funding program for energy efficient buildings, a really large one. And here we have as input the data from the evaluation report 2021 to 2023. The second one would be a funding program from the transport sector. So basically a funding of electric vehicles, again, a relatively large funding program. And here we have input data for 2016 to 2023. And the last one is a funding measure, again, for energy and resource efficiency in industry. And here we have, again, data for 2019 to 2023. So do you have any wish which one to use? Otherwise, I would suggest to take for the moment the transport one, as this is nice to show some specific aspects. But if you want to have some of the others, feel free. All right. No wishes, then I will jump directly to the tool. All right. You see the screen again? Yes, perfect. All right, this is basically the project website. And as I said, the tool is open source and free to use. So you can just go to the project website and then directly click on the banner to end up at the starting page of the tool. As I said, we have the main part of the tool, and as I not said, but now I can edit. We have also 2 smaller different modules in the tool, which provide a connection to the Odyssey Muir project, basically. I don't know whether you're familiar with this project, but these are two databases, one on energy efficiency statistical data, so top-down data, and the other one, the MIR database, is more or less a policy database, but also incorporating the impacts in terms of energy savings per measure. So these are two sources you can use as a starting point in the tool. If you don't have your own data, you can jump in and one of these two sub-modules. But for the moment, let's go with the main module. So here, just select the region you're interested in. In our case, as use case is Germany, we would go for Germany and the whole country. And then press on start, and then you end up in the main input window for the tool, which consists of the options and then the programs. And you can also add several option programs. And here it's basically the only important thing to know is that each program in the end will provide you accurate results. So if you want to compare different programs or different improvement actions, you need to put them into two different programs, and then you will have separate results for these. All right. We have also the option to save your inputs and then to re-import these. And that's exactly what we have done, for example, for this use case. So here now I've imported with one click all the inputs and adjustments we have made for this transport measure, so the funding of electric vehicles. You can see the time frame 2016 to 2023. If you need more years, you can just add them here and delete them. You select the subsector, you select the unit of the savings you enter and the starting year, basically, and now you would already be ready to go. However, if you have more data as said, you have also the possibility to adjust the global parameters or the advanced parameters. As already presented in the global parameters, we have the energy mixes. So in our case, for example, the average transport energy mix would be of interest, of course. And for the ex post data, we use Eurostat data, basically. And for future values, we use a EU reference scenario, and hopefully soon also the next reference scenario as soon as it is published. Then we have energy prices. Again, on a sectoral level, we have the electricity generation mix, we have the heat generation mix, and we have the monetization mix. And here for the electricity generation mix, you see some adjustments. So this is not the default data. As we now, for this set of input data, we assume that all funded electric vehicles will be only used applying renewable electricity. So, and then we could also go later in the next step, we could reset these parameters to the default and then have a look how the results change if we would take the default electricity mix and not assume that all these cars are powered by renewable electricity. All right, so but that's basically the way you can adjust all these global parameters, and then all these global parameters here, the monetization factors, will have an impact on all the improvement actions and all programs you analyze at once. In addition, we have also the so-called advanced parameters. And these are basically parameters which are adjusted only for one improvement action. So if you have several improvement actions, if you change something here, it will not affect the other one. So that's really to fine-tune your analysis in the end. And here, for example, in the transport sector, we have now, for this improvement action, we have main parameters, for example, the investment costs, which were, of course, adjusted according to the available information from the evaluation of this measure. We have the fuel switch parameters, so basically what is removed from the system, right, and what is introduced. In this case, it's quite easy because we only have a look at electric vehicles. So oil is removed 100% and electricity is installed, and we excluded from the input data all hybrid cars, for example, and so on. And then you can also provide the efficiencies of the introduced and removed technologies. So to say, that the tool can then calculate what was basically saved and maybe whether there were some additional energy uses due to the fuel switch. All right, if you have set up all those parameters as you wish, you could save them to import them later or directly press on Analyze to end up in the results section. So here we now see the results section. We see it's structured exactly along the way as recommended in the guidance note. So we have the quantification, we have the monetization, and we have an overview tab. So basically just an overview of all the monetized values, and then the cost benefit analysis in the end. All right, for all indicator results, if you click just through them, for example, in this case, we would, of course, because we're in the transport sector, not have an impact on energy poverty or the building-related health impacts. But for all indicators, the structure is always the same. So you have the results or the figures and some subdivisions sometimes, which you can also select and deselect. You have a short description of the indicator and maybe some important information you need to know. And we have a link towards the documentation for each indicator. So this one, which will end up in the more technical documentation of the tool. So make it a little bit bigger. And we have a link to the fact sheets. So that's a little bit more detailed, more elaborated background information on how this indicator was set up, what data was used, what is the reasoning behind this indicator, and so on. And these are also currently updated, so you will find new versions rather soon in the tool to also accommodate for the renewable part of the tool, for example. So that's exactly the same for all indicator categories. And here we see, for example, if we have a look at the primary savings per energy carrier, as we assume that all electricity is provided by renewables, we see that, okay, we have some additional renewable generated energy which comes on top, so which needs to be subtracted, of course, from the saved energy. But the saved oil on the opposite is, of course, then bigger than the figures you entered, right? Because due to the fuel switch, and if you then just provide the sum of all savings, because of this additional energy, we will end up with more oil saved. And that's why it's important to have, for example, these efficiencies and removed and installed energy carriers and technologies included in the advanced parameters. Then the next step is the monetization. Here we don't have this differentiation across the three categories because the list of indicators is much shorter now. And here the structure is exactly the same otherwise. So we have a description and we have the links again to the fact sheets, relevant ones, and the documentation in the tool, which is also accessible as a whole here on top. Then we have an overview. However, this will most likely be reworked a little bit in the future before we finalize the project, but that's basically just an overview of all monetized impacts over the years. And as you can see here, for example, the impact on GDP is quite substantial. However, it's important to keep in mind, and that's then also a little bit clearer in the CBA, that not all these indicators are equal. So, for example, the impact on GDP is a once-off indicator, right? So you have an investment, you have the impact on the GDP due to the investments you make in your country, and depending on the technologies and the sector and so on. But then once you have made these investments, this impact will not reoccur in the coming years. However, if you have, for example, the saved energy cost or a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and the societal cost of carbon, this is something which will reoccur every year over the lifetime of the measure and the energy savings. So that can now look quite smaller, but if you have a long lifetime, this can sum up and can be even more important in the end than these bigger one-offs you have. And then the last thing we have in the tool are is the CBA, so the cost-benefit analysis. And here, as I said, you have the possibility to select and deselect the different indicators. Per default, we have deselected the impact on GDP because that's a little bit, most people don't want to have it in their CBA, but a lot of some stakeholders also wish to have it included here. So we have the possibility to include it if you like. But as you see, these one-offs have then also quite a heavy impact, but they are much more, of course, abstract and also prone to double counting than some of the other indicators. However, for all the other indicators, they are included per default, but then you can also decide, okay, I want to not include some of these, or you want to have, for example, have only a look on the health-related impacts and so on, and then you can select and deselect all the indicators and see how these selection changes your results. And now for this example, so for this funding program, you see that the annuity is still as positive. We then go to the information button. You see that in the definition in the tool, if we have a positive annuity, that means that the cost outweighs the benefits. If we would have a negative annuity, then it would be vice versa. So for this measure, we would have not a positive outcome in monetized terms. However, if you would now, for example, include the impact on GDP, this would change for this measure. But of course, these results can be quite different for different measures, different analysis. For example, for the residential funding program, we have a different picture, and we see that already without the GDP, the measure has a negative annuity, so overall positive outcome in terms of monetary values for society as a whole. You see, as explained earlier, all the different CBA indicators for which results are provided. Each of one of these has some information button again, where you can then also get a little bit more background information on how to interpret these indicators. And then you can change central parameters such as, wait a second, such as, for example, the discount rate, and then see, okay, what is the impact of the discount rate? You can scale the investments provided in the tool as some kind of sensitivity analysis, and also the energy prices can be then scaled accordingly, just to get a feeling of, okay, what is the impact on these different parameters on your analysis. So that's really one quick run through the tool with all you need to know. If you want to not only work in the online version of the tool with the results, you could also export the results and then work further in an Excel sheet to tweak it, to make some additional calculations with the data and so on. Or you can directly only use the tool or use the API to directly provide the results to your tool, to your model, to whatever you're interested to use. All right, the more or less exactly same approach we would have if we now would go stick to Germany. If you're interested in the renewable part of the tool, then you would just select, instead of energy efficiency, you would select renewable. And then, as I said, the overall structure is exactly the same, just a little bit what you select in which step changes now, of course. So now you don't select a sector or subsector, you select a technology. For example, let's say we're interested in solar PV. Again, the unit is now only one, but that's something we also plan to extend. And then the subtype of technology, basically. So in the case of solar PV, you could decide between rooftop or utility scale, which would then have an impact, for example, on the default investment parameters used in the tool, or on the capacity factors, for example. So then you would select this. You could then provide some inputs again, and then of course also the advanced parameters are slightly different here. However, the overall structure again is exactly the same. So we have some main parameters, for example, capacity factors, running costs, and variable running costs are now additional to the general investments. So these are new due to the renewable module. We have again affected fuels. So basically this just tells you which, for each kilowatt hour electricity produced by this renewable technology, what share of electricity produced by fossil fuels or other energy carriers is removed from the system, right? And this is then used to calculate, for example, again, like GHG emission savings, or the avoided energy cost, let's say, for the renewable module. And these values are based on some parameters and some model runs done with a primes model. So also that it's like coherent with a reference scenario data we use in the tool. So, but it can be altered if you have some specific use case or just more reliable and more specific data. And then again, we have some specific, in this case, for example, indicators, for example, the number of affected dwellings if you have rooftop PV to calculate the impact on energy poverty, for example. All right, that's a really quick run through the tool. I hope I was able to cover more or less everything, that you have now an idea where to go. In general, all the documents which were sent by my colleague in the chat are also available directly on the project website under the library tab. You'll find also all fact sheets. You find the reports, also some, if you're interested in some national showcases where we use the tool on specific measures to obtain results and to discuss them accordingly. So all 3 measures, for example, I've shown for Germany on the one slide are analyzed in this German showcase, for example. And we have some more information material, such as, for example, this training material and training guideline available. So if you want to have a step-by-step guidance through the tool, that can also be done again then, or if you have forgotten some of the stuff I mentioned now, you can have a look again at the training guideline, which will also be updated over the summer to also have a guideline for the renewable module. But as I said, it's rather similar than the efficiency model. Maybe 1 or 2 aspects I can mention already. So what we are planning for the remaining time of the project is to fine-tune a little bit still the tool itself, the user guidance, but also we are working on the tweaking or addition of some specific indicators. So we have included for the renewable module, for example, an indicator on land use and critical raw material consumption. These are already available in the tool now, but still needs to be, the description needs to be added and so on. That's also work which is done currently. And we are currently working on an indicator impact on public budget, because this is one which was requested by a lot of stakeholders. So this will probably also be added in the future to the tool. And we are still fine-tuning a little bit the, for example, for the renewable module, the impact on energy poverty is currently still fine-tuned, and the impact on energy cost savings, basically. As this is a little bit more complicated, of course, than for the energy efficiency, where you can just use the end user prices, for example, as a proxy of the energy cost savings of the saved energy. But for the renewable production, it's a little bit more tricky, but that's also which will be implemented over the next few weeks, or at least latest until early autumn.